So that's worth calling out because, again, a lot of ideas, I think, the authors of this paper were very careful, as they should have been, and were, in their methods and in their discussion section about what this meant. But a lot of times when this data gets out into the world, it acquires a bit of a life of its own. So, what does this mean? Oh, that's not highlight of that. So, at least on this paper, there isn't really any evidence that crossword puzzles are associated with preventing dementia. And a second really interesting thing from this paper is, hey, different things work differently. So we might think, well, board games, crossword puzzles, what's the difference? But when it was looked at in this really large study, it really does look like there probably is a difference between crossword puzzles and board games. And the scientists will come upon us to sort of figure out what are those differences and what are they important. Which is another way of saying, well, what's the true active ingredient in cognitive stimulation? So, there's no such thing as generic cognitive stimulation. And, although this paper is often cited as saying it means that generic cognitive stimulation prevents dementia, it really doesn't say that. And I think I'm not going to talk anymore about this, but correlation is not causation. It's not necessarily true that just because people engage in these activities, they didn't go into dementia. I'll talk about that a bit later. So just because I want to hammer away on crossword puzzles for a minute, because I think all of us in the field get this question so much when we talk to people about the work we're doing, here's another study. This one was done by Tim Salthouse from the University of Virginia. And he published a really wonderful paper in Psychological Science in 2006, where he really systematically demolished the notion that generic cognitive stimulation is associated with a slowing of cognitive decline. There are many, many figures and data in this paper. I'm just going to point out one. He asked a pretty simple question, which is, well, if I get a couple hundred people into my lab of different ages and who do different amounts of crossword puzzles, and I give them cognitive tests, it seems that if crossword puzzles are helpful, the folks who do a lot of them should score better on those cognitive tests. Well, that doesn't turn out to be true. Again, I apologize for the size. This is a little small. But the main point is that if you look at people who do a lot of puzzles shown in circles and not many puzzles shown in those upside-down triangles, and you look at their cognitive function as a function of age, those lines basically sit right on top of each other. There's no evidence that there's a systematic difference in cognitive function, and most importantly, there's no evidence that there's much of a difference in slope of these lines. There's no evidence that the folks who do crossword puzzles, decline more slowly than the folks who don't. So why might that be? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but I think in the spirit of this talk, I'll mention the slide that Dr. Small showed around, what happens to brain activation when we learn a new activity? Well, the answer is that once we do it a lot, brain activation kind of goes away. The brain automatizes that performance. And in fact, most people who do crossword puzzles have been doing them for years and years and years and years. And, I don't know if you've done these things, Gary would be interested to take a look at sometime, but I would expect that if you were to throw someone in the fMRI who's done 30 years of crossword puzzles and have them do a crossword puzzle, not much of the brain is going to turn on. So, crossword puzzles really, really haven't been shown to work. Now, that's not to say that they don't. I think everyone here would welcome a large-scale, randomized, controlled trial to evaluate the efficacy of crossword puzzles, but it's never been done. And I have to say that the fact that the NIH and the NIA have spent so much money in related areas and no scientist has ever gone to them with a trial of crossword puzzles suggests that in our hearts, most scientists aren't really very confident in the idea that that trial would work. So how do we know what works? What they pointed out so far is that it's not necessarily intuitive. We can't just sort of guess and say, well, this might work, let's have a lot of people do it. We need to see that it works. Well, again, Gary's pointed out the answer here. So Gary, I've taken a liberty of recasting your slide here slightly. I hope that's okay. This is the abridged and illustrated version. The other points are equally important as well. But I'm just going to say 3 of them. Has it been scientifically tested? Do the cognitive benefits generalize to the real world? And do people like to do it? This is like physical fitness. People, as Dan has pointed out, people have to like to do it to gain any benefit out of it. Well, these are good hurdles. And, one of your points, Gary, was what should the standards be? And I think the answer to your own question, these are pretty much the standards.